All right, we're back. AP Government. I'm going to do a little review of these three foundational documents that you absolutely should know for the exam. Um, this is even going to cover into the Bill of Rights a little bit, but um, so we're going to cover the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and the Constitution of the United States. These three foundational documents represent not only the main ideals of what you should know about our government in the United States, but also basically it gives you a pretty good overview of where we were at as a country during each time period. So if you can understand sort of the context for each document, you'll really understand what the government was aiming for at that time and as it relates to those theories of governance we were talking about before. So, for example, the Declaration of Independence, you could almost relate to that idea of a participatory democracy, a participatory theory that we're fighting for our right to independence and to self-government. So we'll talk about the main ideas there. And then we had to kind of pull our stuff together and create a government that was against this idea of a tyrannical monarchy. So we went to the extreme. I've given you guys this analogy before, but like this was our breakup letter, and now this is our rebound government, that we needed to go as far away from the idea of a tyrannical monarchy. So we created a confederacy, and that's why we call it the Articles of Confederation, where the states have more power. And then when that didn't work out, we needed to write a second draft, find a more stable boyfriend, and that represents the Constitution of the United States. And we'll look at the structure and function of the Constitution of the United States. So let's start with the Declaration of Independence. Here we are at the signing of the Declaration of Independence. It was written by Thomas Jefferson and others. There was a whole committee, but he gets a lot of the credit, mostly because he ripped off almost verbatim some of the language of John Locke, but he was the writer. And then it was signed from representatives of the 13 colonies on July 4th, 1776, thus our Independence Day. And it outlines our reasons for declaring independence from England. It was broken into four main parts. So a preamble, which is kind of the introduction and gives us the what's happening in this paper, basically. The natural rights of man is our reasoning and our justification for breaking away, that we are entitled to our natural rights, which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Then it lists all the grievances against the king. Again, it's like a breakup letter. It's basically, he did this, he did that. He took away our right to self-government, and he quartered soldiers into our homes, and he's just an overall bad guy. And then finally, sort of our conclusion, our resolution of independence, and our announcement of separation that, hey, we're starting our own thing now. Don't you worry about us. But most of it is complaints about the king and lists for very specifically actions that the king took against the colonies. So the main ideas in the Declaration of Independence are these: the natural rights, that is, natural rights by John Locke were life, liberty, and property. I think Jefferson was probably a little bit wary to identify property as a right, but he said natural rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that if a government should not protect those rights, then it is our power as a people to go against that government, to overthrow that government, and institute one that suits us. That's also kind of the idea of a social contract. A social contract basically says that when you enter into a society, you have certain rights, natural rights, and if the government does not protect those natural rights, then you can start a new one. that is the exchange, that the government protects you for you giving up some freedoms, that like we don't run around naked in a society because it makes people uncomfortable. And as long as you don't do that, you won't get arrested, kind of thing. That's the social contract. You don't go around murdering people, or else your rights of life and liberty can be taken away. That's the social contract. A representative government is also mentioned in here, that we should have a representative that abides by the will of the people, and that there should be consent of the governed of that representative, that we, the people, give consent to our government. And again, if we don't agree with what that government is doing, then we vote them out. We write the Articles of Confederation. We write a Declaration of Independence that says, hey, we're out. So that's the Declaration of Independence. This is a foundational document. You should know the main ideas and who wrote it and the basic outline of it for this exam. So we're now going to move into how we even got to the Constitution. We're going to talk about the Articles of Confederation first, and then some of the conflicts that were happening that led to compromises in our Constitution. So I like this graph here. Kind of shows what the dichotomy the AP creates, which is that of liberty and order. So on the far left, we see the purge, right? That represents anarchy. And not that our society is based on anarchy, but if we went super far over to the left, with total freedom, doing what you want, that's closer to liberty than order. I put a monarchy way over here on the right because that's more total control. So this is kind of the scale of a stronger government, right? Like less government means more liberty for the people. More government means less liberty for the people, or more order over the people, or control over the people. So when we wrote the Declaration of Independence, our first form of government was the Articles of Confederation. We wanted total liberty. Like I said, it was our rebound government. We're going to write a form of government that gives total control to the people and to the colonies, which are now states, that they can have whatever currency they want. They can trade with whoever they want. They don't have to pay taxes to the federal government. That was our big beef, right? But that instituted a lot of problems, which we'll talk about. So then we had to write the U.S. Constitution, which was sort of a balance between a stronger federal government and liberty for the people. It wasn't so much liberty. It did take some powers away from the state and gave it to a federal government. So Confederacy being stronger state government, and a federal government being stronger federal government or national government. Sorry, Janet, I know you don't like that they mean the same thing. So why we wrote the Constitution is because the Articles of Confederation, quote unquote, a league of friendship between the states, didn't really work out for us. So there were some problems. It basically failed. The Articles of Confederation did fail, partially because of these economic concerns. There was no common currency. There was no power to tax the states, and there was no power to regulate trade between the states and other nations, or just between the states themselves. Legislatively, it was also really hard to pass laws. You needed 9 out of 13 states to agree to a law, so that made lawmaking very slow. And that meant only 5 states were needed to block a law. And so that also made representation of the states unequal. So basically it meant that each state had 1 vote in the federal government to pass laws. And so that meant 5 small states like Rhode Island or New Jersey could, even though they had a smaller population, could block something that the larger states like Virginia or New York wanted. So this was a huge problem. The other major issue of the Articles of Confederation was that there was no real powerful central government. Like I said, there was a Congress, was only a Congress, really. There wasn't a president or a judiciary at this point. It's just a Congress that had at least one representative from each of the 13 states at the time. And there's no central government that really had any power. There's no central army to help protect us against wars from other nations, or there's no protection from internal threats of our own. And that is when Shays' Rebellion really comes up. I keep forgetting to fix this. It should be Shays, no apostrophe, but Shays' Rebellion. So Daniel Shays was a farmer who went to fight in the Revolutionary War, fought for this to win this country against the British, and he returned to being overly taxed by the state of Massachusetts, and he was going to lose his farm. So basically, he gathered other farmers that were facing the same threat and rebelled. They went and they protested against the Massachusetts courts, and it was a huge rebellion. It was an indication. This was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back for Washington and the other founders of the Constitution. Is that, look, we can't even protect our country against ourselves. Like, we look stupid. So this basically led to the writing of the Constitution. So this is kind of an outline of it. It's broken up into a preamble, 7 articles, and then amendments. So the largest portion is Article 1, which outlines the legislative branch. Article 2 outlines provisions for the executive branch or the president. And then Article 3 outlines provisions for the judicial branch. Article 4 is relationships among states. So what states can and cannot do in the government, how states are added, how debts will be paid, etc. Article 5 was important because it allowed this document to be changed. Article 6, this is where the debt supremacy, Article 6 is kind of like a mixture of stuff. Article 6 is where the supremacy clause is the most important clause that you should know. For Article 6 is basically that the national government has more power than the states. That's the most important part of Article 6. And then Article 7 is how we were going to ratify the Constitution, which abided by the Articles of Confederation that you needed 9 out of 13 states to agree to ratify it. Then we have the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, which is the Bill of Rights, which protects individual rights against the federal government. And then we have 17 more amendments, which are formal changes to the Constitution. So one big thing in terms of the structure of the Constitution, to point out here is that under the Articles of Confederation, we were a confederacy. So just to repeat myself, right, that most of the power was given to the states, and we had just a tiny one chamber of Congress that represented the national government, and nothing was getting done. So states had most of the power in a confederacy. And this was not working. So we created a system of federalism in the Constitution, which divided power between state and local government and national government. This allowed states the power to tax their people, as well as the national government to tax the states and to pay for programs like a national army or navy, and to pay off debts of states that were indebted by the war, and to just basically create a working system of government that protected the people. So, definition of federalism: division of power between local, state, and national government. So the second major problem that worried a lot of people when writing the Constitution was this idea of a strong central government, that we just got away from a tyrannical monarchy. How are we going to make sure that this new government by the Constitution wouldn't overpower the people and the rights of those people? So one solution drafted by Madison in the Constitution is this idea of a separation of powers, that we would have a legislative branch that writes and passes laws. This is our Congress. We would have an executive branch that enforces those laws, such as a president, and that we would have a judicial branch that decides if those laws are legal and fair according to the Constitution of the United States, and that power would be divided between those three branches: legislative, executive, judicial. The idea is that no one branch would become too powerful. They were especially afraid of what a president could do with too much power. So it wasn't enough to just separate the branches. They also created a system of checks and balances. So they not only divided the powers, but they made sure that no one could achieve their powers without checking in with one of the other branches. It's like a giant game of rock, paper, scissors, that if the legislative branch wants to pass a law, the executive or the president needs to sign off on it. And if the president wants to make a treaty with France, then the Senate has to approve it. If the executive wants to nominate someone to the Supreme Court, then the legislative branch has to approve it. If the legislative and the executive pass a law that the Supreme Court finds unconstitutional, then the Supreme Court can strike that down. That's a system of checks and balances. And here's a little chart of that dynamic between the legislative, executive, and judicial. Okay, so this is where we get into some of the compromises in the Constitution, and most of the battles and arguments in the Constitutional Convention were over representation in the Constitution, so how Congress would represent the people of the United States. So the idea here is there were two sides in this argument. So it was basically the large states versus the small states. So for example, if we wanted to pass a law to raise taxes, then we would put it to a vote, right? And if each state had one vote, regardless of their population, then we could have 4 million people in Georgia and Connecticut make the decision of no, we should not raise taxes, even though there's 5 million people in New York that might want to raise taxes. So it's 2-1, right? So no to raising taxes. This was the system under the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation basically said one state, one vote, doesn't matter what your population is. But the Articles of Confederation have failed, and so we had to come up with a new idea in the Constitution. So proposed by the Virginia plan. Virginia was a large state. The Virginia plan basically said, okay, well, what if we had a representative in a House of Representatives that represented 1 million people? Well, in the Constitution, it was 30,000 people, but I'm going to make it 1 million, like one representative for every million people, and each representative will vote. So that would say, okay, just to repeat myself, equal representation would say that one state, one vote, right? That was actually the New Jersey plan. Pardon my mix-up, which we already talked about, right? All states have equal votes. The New Jersey plan would basically say one state, one vote. But if we, as I just said before, if we had a representative government based on the people or the population, and we had one representative for every million people, it would be a vote of 4 to 5. And the question is, are we going to raise taxes? In this case, yes, we would raise taxes. This is called proportional representation. This was also called the Virginia Plan at the Constitutional Convention. You get votes based on your population. So the solution, the compromise, is actually called the Great Compromise or the Connecticut Compromise, which resulted in a bicameral Congress, that we would have 2 chambers of Congress in our legislative branch, that we would have a House of Representatives based on proportion, that we'd have one representative for every 30,000 people in the House, and that we would have a Senate which gave every state 2 representatives no matter what their size. So even if you're a tiny little state, you would have 2 senators and at least 1 representative in the House of Representatives. So if a law was to be passed, it would have to go to each chamber to be approved. So in this case, if we wanted to raise taxes and it was passed in the House and then it goes to the Senate, it was passed in the Senate, then the law passes. In this system, a majority of the people want it based on the House of Representatives, and a majority of the states want it based on the Senate. So the Senate represents the states, the House represents the people. Okay. But the reverse could happen as well. Maybe it goes to the House and the people want it, but it goes to the Senate and the states do not want it, then it does not pass. So in this system, a majority of the people wanted it, but a majority of the states do not, so it does not become a law. But again, remember checks and balances. Even if it did get passed, it would have to go to the president to be signed. The other representative conflict is the infamous Three-Fifths Compromise, which is our racist legacy in this country. So in the Constitution, it says that representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states, which may be included within this union according to their respective numbers, numbers meaning population, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. All other persons is code for slaves. So it kind of looks something like this. So North Carolina is a slave state, Massachusetts is a free state. Let's just say North Carolina has 4 million free people and Massachusetts has 4 million free people. Because they have an equal population here, according to the House of Representatives, they would get an equal number of representatives, right? They have the same number of representatives and would be taxed the same. But that wasn't the case. North Carolina actually has slaves. So what do we do about that? This isn't a voting population. They don't have rights in North Carolina. So North Carolina would want to count them for the purposes of representation, but maybe not for taxation. But they still want reps in Congress because that gives them power. Massachusetts is like, no, not just because they care about the slave population in North Carolina, but that would give North Carolina more power than Massachusetts when actually they have less free people than Massachusetts. So if North Carolina has 1 million slaves included in their total population, they want equal representation in Congress, but not equal taxation. However, Massachusetts has the same population without slaves. They want North Carolina to have equal taxation, but less representation in Congress. So this was the solution. It seems like something children would come up with, but children aren't even this stupid. But anyway, instead of counting the slaves as 1 million people, since they were not a voting population, they decided to count every 5 slaves as 3. So instead of 1 million people, they would have 600,000 slaves, but this would still more than likely give them another vote in the House of Representatives. So slaves would now be counted as 3/5 of a person. So for every 5 slaves, they would actually be counted as 3. This gave slave states a third more seats in Congress and therefore a third more of a voice and a third more power in Congress than the northern free states. So the result of this is that they would perpetuate slavery for a really long time in Congress, and it wasn't ended until the Civil War. So other compromises that were made in the Constitution is that they also kept the slave importation of slaves for another 20 years. They did not make it illegal for another 20 years to import slaves. And then even after that, there was a lot of illegal slave trade in the United States. So the importation of slaves was still kept in the Constitution. The Electoral College and how we pick our president was also a compromise made because people were worried that, the founders were worried that the people could not make an informed decision about who the president should be. The idea that we can change the Constitution via amendments is also a compromise made in the Constitution. And the Bill of Rights, adding protections against the federal government on the first 10 amendments, was basically the reason the Constitution was passed, and what I will talk about in my next video with the Federalists versus Anti-Federalists. Thank you.